It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge. The local park, a sprawling expanse of green nestled between rows of picturesque houses, was alive with the sounds of laughter and play. Children ran across the grass, their joyful shrieks echoing through the trees, while parents lounged on benches or picnicked under the shade of tall oaks. The scene was almost idyllic. The kind of day that made Oak Ridge feel like the perfect place to raise a family. Karen Turner, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, strolled through the park with a sense of routine satisfaction. A woman in her mid-40s with neatly styled blonde hair and a crisp white blouse, Karen prided herself on being a vigilant member of the community. She knew nearly everyone who frequented the park, from the joggers who lapped the trails every morning to the families who played on the weekends. It was her park in many ways, and she felt a duty to keep it safe and orderly. As Karen made her way down the familiar path, something caught her eye. A family setting up a picnic on the far side of the park, near the playground. There was nothing unusual about a family enjoying the park on a day like this, but something about this particular group drew Karen's attention. She noticed the father first, a tall black man in his late 30s, who was laughing as he spread a blanket on the grass. His wife, a striking woman with natural curls and an easy smile, was unpacking a basket while their two children, a boy and a girl, chased each other around the blanket. Karen paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the family. She didn't recognize them, which was odd because she knew almost everyone in the neighborhood. They were clearly enjoying themselves, but a small voice in Karen's mind whispered that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the fact that they were new, or perhaps it was something else, an unease she couldn't quite put her finger on. She stood there for a moment, watching as the father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, her delighted squeal cutting through the air. The mother, noticing Karen's gaze, waved politely. Karen forced a smile and waved back, but the unease lingered. She continued her walk, but her mind kept returning to the family. Were they visitors? New to the area? Or were they just passing through? As she circled back towards the playground, Karen noticed a few other familiar faces. Mrs. Jenkins, a retiree who often walked her dog in the park, and the Martins, a young couple with a toddler. She approached Mrs. Jenkins, who was sitting on a bench knitting. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Karen remarked, taking a seat beside her. "Oh yes, perfect weather," Mrs. Jenkins replied, not looking up from her knitting. Karen hesitated, then nodded towards the family. "Do you know them, the ones with the picnic?" Mrs. Jenkins glanced up briefly, squinting in the direction of the family. "No, can't say I do. They must be new around here." Karen muttered, more to herself than to Mrs. Jenkins. "I just don't remember seeing them before." Mrs. Jenkins shrugged, uninterested. "People come and go, Karen. It's a park, after all." Karen nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She stood up, excusing herself, and continued her walk. But instead of relaxing, she found herself growing more anxious with each step. The family seemed happy, but what if they weren't just a normal family enjoying the park? What if they had other intentions? The park had always been a safe space, and Karen didn't want anything to disrupt that peace. By the time she reached the other side of the park, Karen had convinced herself that it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. She pulled out her phone and called her friend Lisa, who lived a few blocks away and was also part of the neighborhood watch. "Hey Lisa, are you busy?" Karen asked when Lisa picked up. "Not really. What's up?" "Well, I'm at the park and there's this family here. I've never seen them before. They're having a picnic, but I just got a weird vibe, you know?" Lisa was silent for a moment. "A weird vibe? What do you mean?" "I don't know. They just seem out of place. I mean, who has a picnic in the middle of the day like this? And they're not from around here, I'm sure of it." Lisa chuckled lightly. "Karen, it's a public park. People come here all the time. Maybe they're just visiting." "Maybe," Karen agreed, but the unease didn't fade. "But what if they're not? What if they're here for, I don't know, something else?" Lisa sighed. "Karen, you're overthinking this. Just let it go." Karen nodded, though Lisa couldn't see her. "Yeah, you're probably right. I'm just being paranoid." But even after she hung up, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced back at the family, now seated and eating their lunch. The father was telling a story, animated and full of life, while the children giggled and the mother watched with a warm smile. Karen's heart pounded as she debated what to do. Finally, she made a decision. It was probably nothing, she told herself, but it was better to be safe than sorry. She opened her phone again, this time dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice wavered slightly as she spoke. Hi, I'm at Oak Ridge Park, and there's a family here that's acting suspiciously. They don't seem to belong here, and I just think someone should check it out. The operator asked for more details, and Karen provided a description of the family, trying to keep her voice steady. When the call ended, she felt a mix of relief and guilt wash over her. Surely she was just being cautious, protecting her community. The police would come, check things out, and if everything was fine, then no harm done. She walked back to a bench near the playground, her eyes fixed on the family as she waited. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching, and her heart began to race. This was it. She was about to find out if her instincts were right, or if she had made a terrible mistake. Karen sat on the bench, her hands clasped tightly together as the sound of sirens grew louder. She tried to appear calm, but her heart was racing, and her thoughts were a jumble of uncertainty. What if she was wrong? What if she had misjudged the situation entirely? But then again, what if she was right? The safety of the neighborhood was at stake, and she couldn't ignore that. As the first police car pulled up to the edge of the park, Karen felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they scanned the area. Karen stood up, waving them over. They approached her quickly, one of them, a tall man with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor, leading the way. "Ma'am, are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice steady but authoritative. "Yes, that was me," Karen replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Thank you for coming so quickly. There's a family over there." She gestured toward the picnic area where the black family was still sitting, oblivious to the unfolding drama. "I don't recognize them, and they've been acting suspiciously." The officer glanced in the direction she pointed. "Suspiciously, how?" Karen hesitated. The family didn't seem to be doing anything out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. "I know it sounds odd, but I just had a bad feeling. They don't look like they're from around here. I thought it was better to be safe and have someone check." The officer nodded, though his expression didn't change. "We'll talk to them. Please wait here." Karen watched as the two officers made their way across the park toward the family. She noticed other park-goers watching as well, some with curious expressions, others looking concerned. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and guilt. She hadn't meant to cause a scene. She just wanted to make sure everything was okay. The officers approached the family, who noticed them only as they got close. The father, who had been playfully tossing a ball with his son, straightened up and exchanged a glance with his wife. Karen couldn't hear what the officers were saying, but she could see the father's expression shift from confusion to a guarded calm. One of the officers asked for identification, and the father, without hesitation, reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. The mother did the same, her face composed but slightly strained as she watched the interaction. The children, sensing the tension, clung to their parents, their playful mood dampened. Karen bit her lip as she watched the officers examine the IDs. The moment stretched on, and she could feel the eyes of other park-goers turning toward her. She didn't know if they knew she was the one who called, but their glances made her uncomfortable, as if she was being judged. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to block out the nervous energy that was building inside her. After what felt like an eternity, the officers handed the IDs back to the parents. They spoke a few more words, and Karen saw the father nodding, his face calm but serious. The officers didn't look alarmed or concerned anymore. In fact, they seemed almost deferential, which puzzled Karen. What had they found out? Who were these people? Finally, the officers turned and started walking back toward Karen. She braced herself, expecting them to tell her everything was fine, that she had overreacted, but the expression on their faces was hard to read. "Ma'am," the lead officer said when they reached her, his voice now less formal, almost cautious. "We've spoken to the family. Everything is in order. They're just here for a picnic." Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. "Oh, I see. I'm sorry if I wasted your time." The officer gave her a long look before speaking again. "Just so you're aware, the man you called us about, he's a U.S. congressman. His wife is a well-known pediatric surgeon." Karen's eyes widened, shock overtaking her embarrassment. "A congressman? Here? Are you sure?" The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They're very well respected in the community. They've been visiting Oak Ridge for years." Karen's mouth went dry. She felt a sinking sensation in her chest as she realized the gravity of her mistake. She had called the police on a family just enjoying a day in the park, a family that not only had every right to be there, but were prominent figures. The very people she had thought might be a threat were the last ones who would ever pose any harm. The officer, seeing the turmoil on Karen's face, softened his tone. "I'm sure you meant well, but it's important to be certain before making a call like that. Things could have gone very differently." Karen nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. The officers gave her a brief nod before heading back to their car, leaving her standing alone, the reality of what she had done crashing down around her. As the police car drove away, Karen glanced back at the family. They had resumed their picnic, though the earlier lightheartedness was gone. The father's arm was wrapped protectively around his wife, who was quietly talking to their children. Karen felt a deep pang of regret. What had she done? She turned and walked away, her steps heavy, her mind racing. She had always seen herself as a good person, someone who cared about her community and did the right thing. But now she wasn't so sure. Had she acted out of genuine concern, or was there something darker at play, something she had never confronted before? As she left the park, Karen couldn't shake the image of the family from her mind. Their calm dignity in the face of her suspicion haunted her, and she knew that this was only the beginning of a long, painful reckoning with herself. The next day, the incident at the park was the talk of Oak Ridge. Word spread quickly, fueled by the presence of bystanders who had filmed the interaction and posted it on social media. Karen had hoped that it would blow over quickly, but the opposite happened. The video went viral, attracting attention from local news outlets and igniting a heated debate online. Karen's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, texts from friends, emails, and social media alerts. She didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened her phone and saw hundreds of comments, most of them scathing. "This is exactly what's wrong with America. Racial profiling at its finest. She should be ashamed of herself." Karen's heart sank as she scrolled through the comments, her face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. She had never intended for things to get so out of hand. She wasn't a racist, at least she didn't think she was. She had just been concerned, trying to protect her neighborhood. But now, seeing the vitriol directed at her, she couldn't help but feel the sting of their words. It wasn't just strangers online who were talking. Her friends and neighbors were too. She received a message from Lisa, the same friend she had called the day before. "Karen, what happened yesterday? People are saying you called the cops on that family in the park. Why didn't you tell me?" Karen didn't know how to respond. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had only been acting out of concern. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. She had called the police because she had made assumptions. Assumptions based on the color of that family's skin, their unfamiliarity in her world. Meanwhile, the black family, Congressman David King, his wife Dr. Renee King, and their 2 children, were also feeling the effects of the incident. They had dealt with racism before, but it never got easier. The day that was supposed to be a relaxing family outing had turned into a reminder that no matter how successful or respected they were, they could still be judged by the color of their skin. David King sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly around a mug of coffee. Renee sat across from him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Their children were in the next room, playing quietly, but they both knew the kids had picked up on the tension. "What do we do now?" David asked, his voice heavy. Renee sighed, running a hand through her curls. "We do what we always do. We keep going. We don't let this stop us. But the video, it's everywhere. Our kids are going to see it. People are going to see it and think that we're victims, or worse, that we're dangerous. Renee reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. We're not dangerous, David. We're just people. People who had a bad experience. But we can't let it define us. We've worked too hard to get where we are. David nodded, though his eyes were still clouded with worry. I know, but I'm tired, Renee. Tired of always having to prove that we belong, that we're just as good as anyone else. Renee squeezed his hand. I know, but we have to keep pushing forward. For our kids, for everyone who looks up to us. We can't let this break us. The couple sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling around them. They had always known that being black in America meant carrying an extra burden, no matter how successful they became. But they were determined to rise above it, to show their children that they could overcome any obstacle. Later that day, David received a call from his campaign manager, urging him to address the situation publicly. The video had not only gone viral locally, but had caught the attention of national media. There was pressure on him to respond, to take a stand against racial profiling. David knew he had to say something. As much as he wanted to put the incident behind him, he realized that staying silent would be a disservice to those who looked up to him, to the people who experienced similar injustices every day without the platform to speak out. That evening, David and Renee sat down together and crafted a statement. It was calm, measured, but powerful. David posted it on his social media accounts, acknowledging the incident, expressing his disappointment, but also calling for unity and understanding. He urged people not to attack Karen, but to use the incident as a learning opportunity, a chance to reflect on their own biases and work towards a more inclusive community. The response was overwhelming. The post garnered thousands of likes and shares, and the comments were filled with messages of support, both from the black community and from allies. It wasn't the first time David had spoken out on racial issues, but this time felt different. This time, it was personal. Meanwhile, Karen's world was unraveling. The more she tried to explain herself, the more it felt like she was digging a deeper hole. She received a call from the Oak Ridge Neighborhood Association, asking her to step down from her position as chair of the safety committee. They framed it as a temporary measure, but Karen knew it was more than that. It was a polite way of distancing themselves from her. Her husband, Mark, who had been supportive at first, was starting to lose patience. Karen, maybe it's time to just lay low for a while. Stop talking about it. The more you try to explain, the worse it gets. Karen felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Mark. I was just trying to look out for our community. Mark sighed. I know you were, but you have to understand how it looks. To them, it's not just about one call. It's about the history behind it, the assumptions, the fear. Karen knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. She had always prided herself on being a good person, someone who cared about others, but now she was being forced to confront the fact that her actions had hurt people, good people who didn't deserve it. As the days passed, Karen found herself avoiding the park, avoiding her neighbors, avoiding the very community she had once felt so connected to. The isolation weighed on her, and she began to realize that the real problem wasn't just what she had done, but what it revealed about her. She had always thought of herself as open-minded, but now she saw that there were blind spots in her thinking, biases she had never acknowledged. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the only way forward was to face these issues head-on. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to learn from it. She could start by reaching out to the family she had wronged, even if it meant facing their anger or disappointment. Karen knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to try. She owed it to them, to herself, and to the community she had always claimed to care so much about. As the days passed, the story of what had happened at Oak Ridge Park continued to spread, but it wasn't just confined to the local community anymore. News outlets had picked up the story, framing it as another example of racial profiling in America. It was a narrative that had played out countless times before, but each instance felt fresh and raw to those involved. Karen tried to avoid the media as much as possible, but it seemed like everywhere she turned, there was another story, another opinion piece, another discussion about what she had done. The weight of it all was overwhelming, and she found herself retreating from the world more and more. She barely left the house, and when she did, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her. The Kings, on the other hand, were thrust into the spotlight in a way they hadn't anticipated. Congressman David King was no stranger to public attention, but this was different. The scrutiny was more personal, more invasive. Despite the support they received, there was also a backlash from some corners, questioning their motives and their handling of the situation. It was a painful reminder of the thin line they walked as public figures and as a Black family in America. One evening, as David and Renee sat in their living room, the exhaustion of the past week weighed heavily on them. The children were asleep, finally, after days of restless nights filled with questions they didn't know how to answer. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" David asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Renee looked up from the book she had been pretending to read. "What do you mean?" "All of it. The work, the constant battle against everything. Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, it's never enough. We're still seen as a threat, as outsiders in our own country." Renee sighed, closing her book and setting it aside. "I know it feels that way sometimes, but we can't give up. If we stop fighting, what message does that send to our kids, to the people who look to us for leadership?" David nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "I just wish it didn't have to be so hard. I'm tired, Renee. Tired of always having to prove that we're good enough, that we belong." Renee reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, but we have to keep going. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to everyone who's come before us. We can't let one woman's fear define us." David met her eyes, finding strength in her resolve. He knew she was right. They couldn't let this break them, no matter how much it hurt. They had to keep pushing forward, for their family and for their community. The next day, David received an unexpected phone call from a producer at a national news network. They wanted to do a live interview, giving him a platform to discuss the incident and the broader issues of racial profiling and systemic racism in America. It was an opportunity to turn a painful experience into a teaching moment, to raise awareness and advocate for change on a larger scale. David hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to relive the events of that day in front of millions of viewers. But after talking it over with Renee, he agreed. They both knew that staying silent wasn't an option. They had to use their platform to make a difference. On the day of the interview, David and Renee sat in their living room, the camera crew bustling around them as they prepared for the live broadcast. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of purpose that gave them both strength. They were doing this for their children, for their community, and for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. The interview began with the host summarizing the events that had led to this moment. As the footage from the park played on the screen, David felt a pang of anger and sadness, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the message he wanted to convey. When it was his turn to speak, David took a deep breath and addressed the camera directly. "What happened to my family at Oak Ridge Park is something that happens far too often in this country. It's a reminder that, despite all the progress we've made, we still have a long way to go. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the fear and prejudice that still exist in our society. We need to have these difficult conversations, to confront our biases, and work together to create a more just and equitable world." Renee chimed in, her voice steady and calm. "This experience has been painful, but it has also opened our eyes to the importance of community. We need to stand up for one another, to support each other in the face of injustice. We can't let fear divide us. We have to come together and fight for what's right." The interview continued, with David and Renee speaking candidly about their experiences, their hopes for the future, and the importance of education and empathy in combating racism. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with viewers praising their courage and strength. As the interview ended and the camera crew packed up, David and Renee felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. They had turned a painful chapter in their lives into an opportunity for change, and they hoped that their words would resonate with others, sparking the conversations that needed to happen. Back in Oak Ridge, the interview had a profound impact. Karen watched it from her living room, her emotions a whirlwind of guilt, shame, and admiration. Seeing the Kings speak so eloquently and powerfully about their experience made her realize just how much she had underestimated them. They were more than just victims. They were leaders, advocates, and role models. Karen knew she needed to do more than just apologize. She needed to change, to confront the biases that had led her to make that fateful call. The King's words had struck a chord in her, and she was determined to make amends, not just to them, but to herself and her community. A week had passed since the incident at the park, and the buzz around the video had finally begun to die down. Karen had spent the time reflecting on her actions, grappling with the uncomfortable truth that she had been wrong. She knew that she needed to make things right, or at least try, so with a nervous heart, she decided to reach out to the Kings. Karen had done some research and found the congressman's public contact information. She composed an email, agonizing over every word. She wanted to apologize sincerely, to express her deep regret for what had happened, but no matter how she phrased it, the words felt inadequate. After several drafts, she finally settled on a message that she hoped conveyed her remorse without making excuses. Dear Congressman King and Dr. King, my name is Karen Turner. I was the person who called the police at Oak Ridge Park last week, and I am writing to you to offer my deepest apologies. I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for the distress and harm my actions caused you and your family. I realize now that my actions were based on unfounded fears and assumptions, and I am deeply ashamed. I want to assure you that this has been a wake-up call for me. I am committed to understanding my own biases and working to change them. If there is any way that I can make amends, please let me know. I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. Sincerely, Karen Turner. Karen hit send and then sat staring at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't expect a response, but she needed to at least try to make things right. 2 days later, much to her surprise, she received a reply. The email was from Dr. Renee King. Dear Mrs. Turner, thank you for reaching out. Your apology is appreciated. We understand that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. David and I have discussed your message, and we would like to invite you to join us at a community meeting we are organizing. The meeting will focus on racial bias and understanding in our community. We believe that open dialogue is the first step toward healing and change. If you are willing, we would welcome your participation. Best regards, Renee King. Karen read the email several times, disbelief mingling with relief. They were offering her a chance to face what she had done, to learn from it, and to contribute to something positive. It was more than she had expected, and she knew she couldn't turn it down. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at a local community center. When the day arrived, Karen felt a mix of nerves and determination as she walked into the building. The room was filled with people, many of whom she recognized from the neighborhood. She saw the Kings at the front of the room, speaking with a few attendees, their demeanor calm and welcoming. As Karen approached them, her stomach knotted with anxiety. But when Renee turned and smiled at her, the tension eased slightly. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Turner, Renee said warmly, extending her hand. Karen shook her hand, feeling the sincerity in Renee's grip. Thank you for inviting me. I didn't know if I'd be welcome. Of course you're welcome, David said, joining them. This meeting is about bringing people together, not pushing them apart. We all have things to learn. Karen nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. I'm so sorry for what I did. I had no right. Renee held up a hand gently. You've apologized and we've accepted it. What's important now is what we do moving forward. The meeting began shortly after, with David and Renee leading the discussion. They spoke about the importance of recognizing and addressing unconscious bias, about how fear and misunderstanding could lead to harmful actions. They encouraged the attendees to share their own experiences and thoughts, fostering a dialogue that was both challenging and enlightening. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she hesitated, feeling the weight of the room's attention. But she knew she had to be honest. "I called the police that day because I saw something that made me uncomfortable," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "But I've realized that the problem wasn't with what I saw, it was with how I interpreted it. I made assumptions that were unfair and hurtful. I'm here today because I want to learn and I want to be better. I'm sorry for what I did, and I hope that by being here, I can start to make amends." The room was silent for a moment, and then someone began to clap. Soon, the entire room joined in. It wasn't an applause of celebration, but one of support and encouragement. Karen felt tears in her eyes, not from shame, but from the overwhelming sense of hope that filled the room. After the meeting, several people approached Karen, thanking her for her honesty and for taking the first step toward change. It was a small step, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild trust and to learn from her mistakes. As Karen left the community center, she felt lighter than she had in days. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that there was much more work to do, both within herself and in her community. But for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, the King family continued their work, both in their professions and in their community. The incident had shaken them, but it had also reaffirmed their commitment to fighting for justice and equality. They were determined to turn their painful experience into something meaningful, to use it as a catalyst for change. As the weeks went by, Oak Ridge began to heal. The community, once divided by suspicion and fear, started to come together. The conversations sparked by the incident led to new initiatives, greater understanding, and a commitment to creating a more inclusive environment for everyone. Karen continued to attend the community meetings, learning more with each session. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but she was determined to keep trying. She had made a mistake, one that she would never forget, but she was committed to growing from it. And in the end, that was what mattered most. This completes the resolution and conclusion of the story, showing Karen's efforts to make amends and the positive impact the incident ultimately had on the community. If there are any adjustments or additional elements you'd like to include, feel free to let me know. In the days following the interview, the mood in Oak Ridge began to shift. The candid discussion led by the Kings had sparked something in the community, a desire for reflection and change. Conversations that had been avoided for too long were now happening in living rooms, coffee shops, and local meetings. People were starting to acknowledge that the comfortable bubble of Oak Ridge was not immune to the problems facing the rest of the country. Karen, too, felt this shift deeply. The guilt she had carried since the incident was now intertwined with a growing resolve to do better. She knew that apologizing wasn't enough. She needed to become part of the solution. It was time to take action. One evening, Karen sat down with her husband, Mark, who had been supportive but distant in the wake of the events. She needed to talk to him, really talk, and make sure they were on the same page. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Karen began, her voice steady but serious. "I know I made a huge mistake, and I can't undo it, but I don't want to just sit here feeling guilty. I want to do something that makes a difference." Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "What do you have in mind?" Karen took a deep breath. "I've been reading about racial bias and how it affects our everyday decisions, even when we don't realize it. I want to start a dialogue in our community, something more formal than just a meeting or two. I was thinking about organizing a series of workshops or discussions, something where we can all learn together without judgment." Mark nodded slowly. "That sounds like a good idea, but do you think people will participate? I mean, this is Oak Ridge. We've always thought of ourselves as a welcoming community, but maybe we've been too complacent." "I know," Karen replied, "but that's exactly why we need to do this. We've been hiding behind that image for too long. It's time to face the reality of our biases, even if it's uncomfortable. And I'm willing to put myself out there, to admit my own failings, if it means we can all grow from this." Mark reached out and took her hand. "I'm proud of you, Karen. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more to try to make it right." Karen squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. I just hope it's enough." With Mark's support, Karen began organizing the workshops. She reached out to local leaders, including the kings, to help guide the discussions. To her surprise, they agreed to participate, seeing it as an opportunity to continue the important conversations they had started. The first workshop was held at the community center, the same place where the initial meeting had taken place. Karen was nervous as she stood at the front of the room, waiting for people to arrive. She wasn't sure how many would show up, but she was determined to make a difference, no matter how small the group. As the room began to fill, Karen was relieved to see a mix of familiar faces and new ones. Some were neighbors who had witnessed the incident at the park. Others were people she had never met before. But all of them were here for the same reason: to learn, to listen, and to grow. Karen started the workshop by sharing her own story, admitting her mistakes and the lessons she had learned. She spoke about the unconscious biases that had influenced her decisions and how she was committed to challenging those biases moving forward. It was difficult to be so vulnerable in front of her community, but she knew it was necessary. David and Renee King spoke next, offering their perspective on what had happened and the broader issues at play. They talked about the impact of racial profiling, not just on individuals, but on communities as a whole. They also emphasized the importance of empathy, education, and open dialogue in overcoming prejudice. The workshop continued with small group discussions, where participants shared their own experiences with bias and discrimination. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, but they were honest and necessary. People were beginning to see that change didn't happen overnight, but through sustained effort and a willingness to confront difficult truths. By the end of the evening, there was a sense of hope in the room. The participants had taken the first step towards understanding and healing, and they were committed to continuing the journey together. As the workshops continued over the following weeks, more and more people joined the effort. The community began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other were now engaging in deep conversations, challenging their own assumptions and supporting each other in the process. For Karen, the workshops were just the beginning. She became more involved in local initiatives focused on diversity and inclusion, using her experience as a catalyst for change. She knew she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew that she couldn't let it define her. Instead, she chose to let it inspire her to be better, to do better, and to help others do the same. The Kings continued their work, both in their professions and in the community. They had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth, not just for themselves, but for Oak Ridge as a whole. They were proud of the progress the community had made, but they knew there was still much work to be done, and they were committed to leading that work together. In the end, the incident at the park became a turning point for Oak Ridge, a moment when the community was forced to confront its own shortcomings and take meaningful steps towards becoming more inclusive. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but the people of Oak Ridge were ready to face them together. Karen often reflected on how much had changed since that day at the park. She was no longer the person she had been, someone who acted out of fear and assumption. She had grown, and so had her community. And in that growth, she found hope for the future. As she walked through Oak Ridge Park one sunny afternoon, she noticed families of all backgrounds enjoying the space together, laughing, playing, and sharing in the simple joys of life. It was a sight that filled her with a deep sense of peace. Oak Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was on its way to becoming a place where everyone truly belonged. And that, Karen knew, was something worth fighting for.